here's the context that we should provide people. The construct of ADHD appeared for the first time in 1987 in the revised edition of the DSM-3. And in case people don't know, the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's the book of mental disorders. It's the book that has all the criteria for different mental disorders. And there are, at this point, over 300 disorders in that book. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it's what psychiatrists and some psychologists use to diagnose people with a mental disorder, including, of course, ADHD. So there's been 5 major editions of the DSM. The first one came out in 1952, and then second one 1968, third one 1980, fourth one 1994, fifth one 2013. And there's been a couple of revised editions along the way, like in 1987. And so there was no such thing as ADHD or really anything even like it in the first edition of the DSM. And at that time, there was only 106 disorders. In the second edition, there was something known as hyperkinetic impulsive disorder, which was kind of what would eventually become ADHD. In 1980, with the DSM-3, there was ADD, attention deficit disorder. And then during the next 7 years, the APA generally agreed that hyperactivity is inherent in this condition. And so in 1987, the published DSM-3 revised edition included, for the first time, ADHD. So that's kind of the evolution of the construct. And then, of course, it has been part of the DSM-4 and 5 with tweaks in terms of its criteria. But I guess the consistent criteria for this condition has been what's described as hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsiveness. Those are kind of the distinguishing features of the condition. And throughout the late 80s and 90s, there was a relatively steady increase in the diagnosis of this condition. But then for the last 20 years, it's been a dramatic rise in the diagnosis of ADHD. And it's now one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions for children. So you've been very critical of the rapid rise of diagnosing kids with ADHD. And you've really carefully deconstructed the construct of ADHD. And you've talked a lot about the problems that come along with understanding children's behavior in this way as a pathological condition, and some of the problems that come along with labeling kids and the stigmatization that can bring with it. So the last thing I'll say before I let you talk again is what the criteria are. I think it's really important that people understand how this diagnosis is made precisely, like what it says in the DSM-5, what your psychiatrist is looking at when they diagnose you with this condition. So the criteria are as follows. For children, I think it's under the age of 16 or 17, you have to have 5 or more symptoms presenting for at least 6 months in at least 2 different settings from these 2 categories here. So again, you have to be presenting 5 or more symptoms from the inattention category and 5 or more symptoms from the hyperactivity category. And again, they have to be presenting for at least 6 months in at least 2 different settings. So there are 9 criteria in the inattention category. They are: often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or other activities. Often has trouble holding attention on tasks. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace, often has trouble organizing tasks and activities, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to do tasks that require mental effort over a long period of time, often loses things necessary for tasks and activities, is often easily distracted, and is often forgetful in daily activities. So those are the 9 symptoms within the category of inattention. Okay. And then under the category of hyperactivity, here are the symptoms. Often fidgets with or taps hands and feet or squirms in seat. Often leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected. Often runs about or climbs in situations where it's not appropriate. Often unable to play or take part in leisure activities quietly. Is often on the go as if driven by a motor. Often talks excessively, often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed, often has trouble waiting their turn, often interrupts or intrudes on others. So those, again, are the symptoms of ADHD according to the DSM-5. If a child meets 5 of them in each of those categories, they are going to be diagnosed with this condition. So I guess the one more thing I just want to say, again, before I let you speak, is it's very important for people to understand the fundamental difference between a diagnosis of a mental disorder and a diagnosis of a physical disease, and why there is any basis for questioning the legitimacy of a mental disorder as a construct. And the difference, the fundamental difference here is that essentially physical diseases are diagnosed objectively. For example, if you, let's take COVID-19. COVID-19 is a distinct entity, right? It's something that you can objectively identify. It is a virus with a particular sequence of DNA, right? And you either have it or you do not have it. It's objective like that. But mental disorders are not distinct and objective like that is. And so when you hear me say the word often for all these symptoms, that's not a very medical term in a sense. Like, what do we mean exactly by often? That's open to interpretation. And so that is the fundamental difference between diagnosing physical diseases and mental disorders, is that mental disorders are diagnosed with a lot of subjective interpretation involved. And that goes into the very writing up and constructing of the concept of ADHD, right? Like, why is it that these kids have to meet 5 and why not 6 and why not 4? It's just kind of something that the committee votes on. And then when it comes to observing their behavior, that is very much so a subjective interpretation about whether they're meeting these symptoms. So just in case people had not really had that articulated to them before, I thought it would be important to say that. And that's why it's totally understandable that so many people question whether these diagnoses are even legitimate.